Okay, this is going to be the last week that we examine the Cold War in Latin America. And we're going to look specifically at Central America because it was during the 1980s when Central America becomes the center of the Cold War. And President Ronald Reagan, who assumed office in 1981, he was going to take a hard stance towards the leftist government that comes to power in Nicaragua in 1979. And he was going to intervene in these conflicts and support military governments. And there were civil wars that were going on in Central America. And they're going to displace about 2 million people in the region. And many hundreds of thousands of them are going to migrate to the United States during this period. So let's begin this lecture video with the Sandinista revolution. And here on the slide you see the Somoza dynasty. This was the family that ruled Nicaragua from 1936 to 1979. And it was Anastasio Somoza, who you see pictured there in the center, who assumed power in 1936. And he was head of the National Guard. And his two sons would later rule in the 1960s and 70s. And the Somozas, they ruled Nicaragua with an iron fist. Anastasio Somoza was very much a dictator, kind of like Rafael Trujillo, who we examined in the Dominican Republic. And they were notoriously corrupt as well. In 1970, the family controlled about 25% of Nicaragua's agriculture and also a large portion of the industry. And in the 1960s, there was opposition that began to form against Somoza. But of course, he was an authoritarian, so he used an iron fist to suppress the opposition. And about 50% of the population lived in poverty. And in the 1970s, this resistance to the Somozas increased. And particularly, it was after a massive earthquake that struck Managua, the capital, in 1972. It flattened the city, particularly the city center, the historic center. And about 10,000 people were killed. And there was an international campaign to send money to Nicaragua to help raise funds to rebuild the city and to alleviate some of the suffering that people had experienced in Managua. But a lot of this money that poured into Nicaragua, a lot of it went into the pockets of the Somozas. And it was blatantly corrupt what they were doing. Therefore, opposition to the Somoza dictatorship continued to grow after the Managua earthquake in 1972. And it was led by a group that were called the Sandinistas, and they were named after a revolutionary from the 1930s, Augusto Sandino, who had been killed in the 1930s. The Sandinistas, they had been part of this wave of guerrilla insurgencies that erupted in the early 1960s that were inspired by the Cuban Revolution, but they were very small in the 1960s. But as the Somoza dictatorship's corruption became blatant and open and opposition increased, the Sandinistas grew more powerful, particularly in the 1970s. And so you're going to have basically two sides here in this civil war that goes on in Nicaragua in the 1970s. On the one side, you have leftists, the Sandinistas, who were backed by Cuba. And there was also many Catholic priests and religious workers who supported the Sandinistas. I'll talk about liberation theology a little bit more in the next lecture video and explain why many Catholics supported leftists during this period. But also supporting the Sandinistas were nationalists, some middle-class reformers who advocated for change, and of course large numbers of impoverished workers and peasants. And then on the other side of the conflict, you have the dictatorship, the military, the conservative Catholic hierarchy, and the tiny oligarchy that had ruled the country for decades and controlled most of the country's resources, and it was backed by the United States. However, as it became clear how corrupt the Somoza regime was and how unpopular it was among the majority of Nicaraguans, the international community, including the United States, abandoned its support for Somoza. And at the same time, the Sandinistas were growing more powerful, and they stepped up their attacks. And for example, in 1978, the Sandinistas attacked the National Palace and held Congress hostage for ransom and release of political prisoners. And this all embarrassed Somoza. And so in 1979, Somoza flees the country, goes into exile, and flees to South America. And of course, he looted the national treasury of over $1 billion that he took with him and deposited in U.S. banks. And that brought an end to the war, at least temporarily. And the country had been devastated. About 50,000 people had died in the conflict, and about a fifth of the population had been displaced. And so this was the context in which the Sandinistas come to power in 1979. And the Sandinistas' goals were, of course, to destroy all the vestiges of the Somoza dictatorship. They nationalized the family's properties. They sought to promote a mixed economy where the government would play a role, but also private enterprise would still be present. They wanted to promote social reforms, gender equality, sought to also promote broader access to basic services such as building healthcare clinics and more schools. They also implemented rent control policies. And the regime was certainly leftist, and many in the leadership were Marxist, but the entire government was not Marxist. And they were supported by Cuba, but I think it would be a bit of an exaggeration to say they were going to install a communist state in Nicaragua. They were in power during the entire 1980s, but this was also a period in Latin America where its economy was greatly suffering, which I'll lecture on next week. And so the results of the Sandinista revolution were quite mixed. Land was redistributed, a minimum wage was enacted. Conditions in the countryside did show some improvement. For example, food consumption in the countryside increased by some 40%. Urban rents were reduced by 50%. School enrollment doubled, and there was a 28% reduction in infant mortality. However, a lot of private investment abandoned the country, and the economy did not do as well as the Sandinistas had hoped. And there were massive floods in 1982, and later there was a drought, so there was some environmental catastrophes that were going on. And as well, of course, women did not gain many of the rights that they had been promised as well by the Sandinistas. So there were mixed results of the revolution. And also at the same time, there was another war that erupted in Nicaragua, and it was what was called the Contra War. When Ronald Reagan assumed office in 1981, he was from the outset very hostile towards the Sandinistas, and he considered them to be communist. And as we all know, Ronald Reagan took a very hard line towards the spread of communism in the Cold War. And he feared that if the Sandinistas were successful, then the revolutionaries in neighboring El Salvador would also be successful. And by the way, the Sandinistas were sending arms to the revolutionaries in El Salvador. And then the revolutionaries would also come to power in Guatemala and then Mexico. And before you know it, communism would be at the doorstep of the United States. This was the domino theory. And so the Reagan administration and the CIA began training counter-revolutionary forces. And they were called Contras. And this is what I refer to as the Contra War. And these Contras, many of them had been supported, the individuals who made up these groups, many of these individuals had been members of or supporters of the Somoza dictatorship, and they had served in the National Guard and the Army. And the goal of the Contras was to overthrow the Sandinista government. But they never were powerful enough to overthrow the Sandinistas. And a clandestine war broke out in Nicaragua. And these Contras, they were pretty much death squads, and they sowed terror throughout the countryside. They destroyed infrastructure, targeted healthcare clinics, kidnapped civilians, they burned villages, and raped women as well. And so they made life very difficult for the Sandinistas and undermined a lot of the gains that had been made by the Sandinistas in the 1980s. And it was this was a very difficult time for Nicaragua and a lot of Nicaraguans. And the country, was just recovering from its war in the 1970s when another war broke out in the 1980s. And the war dragged on throughout the 1980s. And eventually, in 1990, elections were held. The Sandinistas never sought to implement a dictatorship. And elections were held in 1990. And in that year, the opposition candidate won, Violeta Chamorro. She was the first female president of Nicaragua. She won, and so the Sandinistas lost power through elections. And a lot of people at the time believed that you had to elect the opposition because that was the only way to end the Contra War. And indeed, a lot of people feared a U.S. invasion if the Sandinistas remained in power. So the opposition won the elections in 1990, and that brought an end to the Sandinista revolution in Nicaragua.